Dean Braxton, the man who died and went to heaven. The interview. So Dean, you were traveling to heaven.
Yes.
And out of the body to be present with the Lord.
Yes.
In the blink of an eye.
Yes.
The twinkle.
Yeah.
It happened just like that.
Mm-hmm.
Now you saw prayers that were going past you.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit more about that and the importance of that?
You know, Pete, that's really a good question because I didn't know the, the magnitude of our prayers, not in the sense of being just answered, but how God wants to hear from us, mm-hmm. you know, until this happened to me. You know, as I was saying earlier, here I am leaving my body to go to be with the Father in Jesus, to be absent from the body, to be in the presence of the Lord, faster than you can blink, faster than the speed of light, faster than the speed of sound. And yet the prayers that people were praying for me and others would pass me by like I was standing still. Mm-hmm. And I saw the end of them, really, their tails of them, you know, like shooting stars. You know how you see shooting stars go across the sky and you really see the tail of it?
Yeah.
That's what the prayers really looked like when they were passing me by. One person asked me one time, how did you know their prayers? I just knew. I just knew. And as I said earlier, I was in my stream of prayers. But what really got me was, here I go and I enter into heaven and these prayers are still coming in from earth. That's where they're coming from. They're coming from earth. And there's, I could say billions, I could say, you know, trillions, and yeah, I feel like even using those terms, I'm real short in how many prayers were coming in from the earth, mm-hmm. and going to the Father. They weren't going, Jesus, you know, they were going directly to what we call the throne of God and going to the Father. A couple of things I learned about those prayers is that I love to point out is, number one, they don't have a shelf life or expiration date, and I didn't know that. You know, I thought, yeah, they probably, and you have to remind God, you know, mm-hmm. that you prayed this prayer. And yet I found out, no. Once they enter into him, because that's what they did, they went inside him. And I didn't know that happened. But Scripture says in Psalms, the 18th chapter, that when David prayed, his prayers literally went inside of the Father. Also, you find out in Revelation, when it talks about the incense rising with the prayers, mm-hmm. if you think about incense, it's smoke. And what's going to happen? It's going to be breathed in. Yeah. So most of us don't know that our prayers don't go just to the throne. They go inside of the Father. Okay? Okay. God has a place inside of you, of himself, for your voice. Is that good news?
That's great news.
And so that was really something that I came to understand. The other thing I came to understand is the reason they were moving so fast, I like to point it out in the Scripture, and it's found in Peter, you know. Let me find this scripture for you real quick. 1 Peter 3:12, it says, "For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are attentive to their prayers." I came to understand, Will, that literally God's up there like, I want to hear from you. Mm-hmm. He is anxious to hear us talk to him. And the reason for that is found in Genesis, the 2nd chapter, the 7th verse, when he made a man. Yes. This is before Eve was made. And he literally gave that man a voice and a mouth. And it wasn't to talk to the animals, it was talk to him. Mm. Our very voice and our very mouth was created for God Almighty. Okay, he wants to hear from us. Secondary is me talking to you right now and you hear me. Primary, this mouth and this voice was created for him, mm-hmm. you know. So that really got me. That's, you know, in the sense of, yeah, now I understand why those prayers would pass me by, because God wants to hear from us. You know, the other thing about prayers that there's a number of things I could talk about, but one of the major things I like to talk, like I said, they don't have a shelf life. They don't have an expiration date on them. That means somebody in your family could have prayed for you generations ago, and God's still operating off that prayer. Mm. You know, it isn't, so most of us think it's just a favor of God, and yet I think what is happening a lot of times is God's answering a prayer that someone prayed over you. Yes. And most people don't know that, but grandmothers, I don't know about grandpas, but grandmothers pray for generations.
Yeah.
Before they even exist on the planet, grandma's been prayed for them.
Yes.
So you think about all those prayers like that. There is a scripture that supports that. And it's found in Acts, the 10th chapter, when this angel comes to this man named Cornelius, and he literally says, your prayers and your good deeds are a memorial before God. The word memorial in the Greek means remembrance.
Okay.
God remembers our prayers.
Yes.
It's like you could have prayed for someone in your family, okay? You don't see the change in their life as you're on this planet.
Right.
Now you leave the planet or you die and go to be with the Father and Jesus in heaven. And yet God still is going to operate off that prayer that you prayed for that family member, even though you're not here. Is that good news?
Amen.
Great news.
So those are the things that really got me about the prayers. And no one's in heaven, I love to say it this way, no one's in heaven as the prayers are coming and say, ooh, ah, wow, like a big fireworks. It's normal. It's normal for prayers to come from the planet that go into heaven and then into the Father. Now, this is what got me. A lot of those prayers weren't from Christians. There were people that were crying out to God for help. That's what really, really, really got me. It wasn't just people like us that, born again. God is hearing people that are not born again, but they're crying for help.
Yes.
And that drives me a lot of times. That's why I go a lot of places, because I heard those prayers as they were going into the Father, and people were crying for help. They were just asking God to help them in some way.
That's amazing, because God hears all of our prayers, and that's very important.
Yeah. So that's what I really. There's a lot more I could say about that, but that would take 2 or 3 more hours.
Okay. Yes. Do you?
Yes, I was curious about something. Dean, there are a lot of images and there's a lot of talk about people actually getting to the gates of heaven and such. Yeah. You talked about your trip there. You just mentioned about the prayers that passed you by. What did you experience when you first got to?
When I came into that light or that window, I came into it. I remember the first thing I experienced. The very first thing was everything was right. There was nothing wrong, and I fit. That's the best way for me to say it. And it was past peace. There's nothing to be peaceful from there. So it's not like, oh, now I got peace. No, it's past that. It's that, and like Philippians says, peace past understanding.
Yes.
That's what it was like. And everything was right, and I fit. That was the other thing. It'd be like a perfect, a round peg going into a perfect hole that's round, and there's no, let's get this edge off, or this gets this edge off. I fit right in. It wasn't like when I got there, all of a sudden, Jesus said, wait a minute, Dean just came in, 2 weeks quarantine over here, that type of thing.
Yes.
We got to wait till he gets some of that stuff off of him from the earth.
Yes.
No. When I got there, I always say, Jesus looked at me, saw himself on the inside of me, and I was in.
You belong.
I belong, yeah. Even the Bible says that when Jesus says, I go to prepare a place for you, most people think that's a mansion or a house. Really what that word means broken down is space. It really does. If you tease it out to the fullness, it means that mansion word means space. When I went to Bible college, I remember they saying that mansion meant dwelling place, or like an apartment. And I thought, I don't want to go get me an apartment, But it really means space. And the way it means space is not like a physical space like we would think. What it means is like, I'm number 2 in my family. I have an older brother, then there's me, and I have 2 younger brothers, okay? If I was to leave the planet or die, the third brother in our family, or my third one right underneath me, doesn't move up and take my place in my family.
Right.
Okay? I always will be remembered as number 2. Well, in heaven, there's a place for you in God's family that no one else can take but you.
Yes.
It's your space. And that's when I say, when I fit.
Yes.
I came right into my space or my place in heaven, and people think physically, no, it's the family of God. Is that good news?
Great news.
Wonderful.
So that's what happened when I first got in. As I was in my space, I was in my place, and I fit, and everything there accepted me. Now, when I say that, some people say, well, they're going to accept this. No, they accept me as God made me. And he made me to be whole. He made me to be peaceful. He made me have joy. He made me to have love. He gave me all these attributes, and I'm now fulfilling fullness of those attributes, and everything accepts me for who I am. It isn't I'm acquired those things. That's who I am now.
Yes.
Is that good news?
You mentioned many of the fruits of the Spirit.
Yes. Very much out of Galatians, the 5th chapter, starting at the 22nd verse, the fruits of the Spirit. Many of those, I sell self-control, and someone says, well, how can you have self-control in heaven? There's nothing to get out of controls, you know what I mean? But in sense of that ability to be able to do those things, that's your natural ability. Something we're always trying to acquire, and yet that's who you really are.
Amen.
Whether we realize it or not, you are a being that can control yourself.
Yes. That's great hope.
Yeah, that is great hope.
So you get there, you find that you fit, it's perfect. You have this peace beyond understanding. Then what? What stands out?
What stood out after that is everything there was glad I was there. The next thing, if everything had a smile, because everything in heaven is alive. I like what Nehemiah in the 9th chapter says. I want to read that because, you hear me say these scriptures. And the reason I bring in the scriptures a lot of times, I tell people, is not that I'm trying to prove myself right. But I tell people, if I just tell you my experience, then it's a story. But if I give you scripture, then you can experience it. And in Nehemiah, the 9th chapter, starting at the 6th verse, it says, you alone are the Lord. You made the heavens, even the highest heavens, along with all their multitude of stars, the earth and all that is on it, the seas and all that is in them. You impart life to them all, and the multitude of heaven worship you. Which is saying everything in heaven is alive. Everything. The grass, the trees, and I don't mean alive like we have here. I mean, it's intelligent, it can speak to you, it can talk to you. Because it's saying here, all of this worships God, okay? And so in saying that to you, when I got there, everything there was glad I was there. Wow. Not just the Father, not just the Son, not just the Holy Spirit residing on the inside of me, but everything. And I like to say it this way. It was like Jesus Christ went before me and told all of heaven I was coming. And they got excited when I showed up.
Yes.
Okay. But I got to tell you this. It wasn't the day when I left my body, or what you guys call dying, that he did it. He did it the day I accepted him as Lord and Savior. So everybody that's born again, Jesus has already announced to heaven, you're on your way. And everything in heaven is excited that you're coming. So when you get there, you're going to see how excited they get.
So when he says, I prepare a place for you, he prepares everything.
Everything. Yeah. That's a good way of saying it. Everything is prepared for you and excited. So when you show up, Pete, they're going to be happy you showed up. They're going to be joyful that you're going to show up. You know what I mean? They may do a little jack dance, something like that.
Which is the reason why all of heaven rejoices when we come to Christ.
That's right. Yeah. I was even there when people came to know Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. And I remember I was at this time at the feet of Jesus, and I heard this sound coming. Even I'd say out of this side of me, it was coming. And I remember kind of sitting up and looking in that direction of where the sound was coming. And everything in heaven was turning toward the throne of God, raising whatever it is, leaves, branches, hands, wings, whatever it is, and shouting the name of the person that just came to know Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, and giving God glory for it. You know what I mean? And so, people don't realize when it says they rejoice or they celebrate, there is a celebration for one of God's children coming back into his fold. Because the celebration is, it's not just you just turn to God. Now you will be with us forever.
So when we talk about a hallelujah praise, that's a hallelujah praise.
That's a hallelujah praise.
Amen.
Okay.
Amen.
So you talk about Jesus. The big question, did you see Jesus?
Yes, I did. The only reason I went there is because of the Father and Jesus, as I stated earlier. Okay, I always tell people I didn't go to heaven to be in heaven. I went there, that's where the Father and Jesus is. I didn't go there to worship the flowers, they're beautiful. I didn't go there to look at the color, they're beautiful. I didn't go there to watch the mountains, they're beautiful. But I went there because Jesus is there. That's why I went there. Okay, and I can remember when I first saw him, I did exactly what the Bible said. Every knee will bow, every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. Yes. I went down on my face before my Lord. Not because someone made me, because I was before my Lord and King of Kings. All right, and so I remember, I didn't even look at his face. I remember when I came into heaven, there was a forest before me, and I knew where he was. No one had to say, well, he's over there. You got the GPS on the inside called the Holy Spirit. He know where Jesus is right now. He know where Jesus is inside of you. Born again, he already know where Jesus is. Okay,
Yes.
so I headed to where I knew he was. It was through a forest. I went through that forest, came out on the other side, and there was Jesus. And around him, half circle, was this huge a gathering of what I call beings. And there were angels and they were redeemed. And they were on this half circle. How many I couldn't tell you. It was thousands upon thousands upon thousands. And he was talking to them or addressing them. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Communicating with them. Mm-hmm. And he was like over on this side of me to the left of me. So I had to come out and head that direction where he was. All right. And I call them beings because they're being everything God created them to be. Yeah. There's nothing. There's nothing. I'm not saying like they're space beings, outer space beings. They're being. They're being. Okay, yes. That's the best way to say it. So as I headed toward him, I remember I got close and I went down on my hands and knees. Automatically went down on my hands and knees, and I'm looking at his feet. I'm not even looking at his face. I didn't really get a good look at his face at that moment. I'm looking at his feet, and when I look at his feet, this is what I said: "You did this for me." That's how I said it. You did this for me. And the next moment, I'm saying, thank you, 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 thank you. I'm giving him praise. No way I just said, now you praise the Lord at this moment. You know, raise your hands, jump around. No. And the reason I said that is because the only reason I was there is because of what he had done. My good works didn't get me in.
Yes.
And my bad works didn't keep me out. You know, I tell people that all the time. You know, I accepted him as Lord and Savior, but he died on the cross. Okay? And because of that, I got in because of him.
Yes.
And I say my good works. My Bible says this to me. We're to do everything as unto the Lord. What I'm doing right now is because of him. You guys are asking questions. He's answering through me. He gets the credit.
Amen.
Okay? He's the one that's doing it. This don't get me in. So my good works don't get me in. And the Bible says that in Ephesians, your works don't get in. But we talk about the bad works, the things that we did wrong. Right. A lot of us think that we got all these things that we did wrong, and when we get to heaven, he's going to open up this book and he's going to start telling you all these things we call it the great white throne of judgment. And that, I'm not saying there's not going to be that. That's going to happen. There is a great white throne of judgment.
Yes.
Okay? But the reality, most of us don't. We're not going to be at that. That's for people that don't know Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. Right. They're going to be, because Jesus Christ took our judgment.
Right.
And most people don't know that. When he died on that cross, the worst judgment you could have is death. And death, true death, is being separated from Jesus.
Yes.
Okay? That's judgment right there. So here it is, you guys. I came to understand that those bad works, they weren't there. And even Jesus, when he looked at me, I'm saying this on purpose, because this is going to get somebody's attention. Okay? When he looked at me like I never sinned in my entire existence.
Wow.
So, Dean, what does it mean that he'll take every account of every idle word you say and tittle and all that stuff? Well, this is what people don't realize. In Hebrews, the 8th chapter and the 10th chapter, it literally tells you when God forgives you, he forgets it. So how can he keep every tab of everything? Okay? So when he forgives you, he forgets it. It doesn't mean that it wasn't being written down. All of a sudden, Jesus came and covered it up. Because if there's a book and he's going to open up that book and he's going to say, okay, Pete, I'm going to start telling you all the bad things that you ever did. And he looks at it, oh, you're born again. Look, there's only one name in your book. It's called Jesus. When he took it, he took it. And most of us don't realize. Even today, when we try to go back and confess our sins to something that we already asked, he has no remembrance of it. The Bible says that in the 8th chapter. You can read it yourself. So when he looked at me like I never sinned in my entire existence.
He looked at you whole.
He looked at me whole, like I never, ever, ever, ever disobeyed him. You know, and that blew my boxes apart because I had boxes that I had, and it wasn't there that boxes were blown apart. It's when I came back to the planet and I thought about what he did. Okay, and there goes that box, and there goes that box, and there goes that box. Okay, but the reality of it is that I came to understand something, that when you ask him to forgive you, he forgives you and forgets it. Why would that be? Because he wants you to get back to work. Because when we start carrying that guilt for us, I can't pray for him because I done this. He wants you to get to work. You need to pray for him.
Yeah,
you understand what I mean? Yeah. I can't talk to them about the love of God because I did this. He wants you to talk about the love of God.
Yes.
Right.
You understand what I mean?
Yeah.
And sometimes we have people in our lives that won't let us forget something. And I would say they're working with the wrong spirit. My Bible says there's one that's called the accuser of the brethren.
Yes.
Okay? And that's the devil. He's always out there to accuse you. But when Jesus forgives you, he forgets it. Then the other question comes up, why should I be this way then? Why should I act this way or that way if it don't get me into heaven? Because that's who you are. You are a Christian, act like it. You know, we talked about the fruit of the Spirit earlier.
Yeah.
There. The fruit of the Spirit is who you are. Start acting like it.
Okay.
Okay.
I'll be that. I'll be that.
That's right. Be who you are. Everything, because the Bible says what? We're a new creation in Christ Jesus. Old things have passed away. Behold, all things have become new. We are, whatever God creates, acts in the nature that it was created in. Bunny rabbits act like bunny rabbits because they were created as bunny rabbits.
Yes.
Cats act like cats because they're created as cats. Horses act like horses because they're horses. They don't have to be taken. You're a horse, act that way. You know, that's who you are. When I was in the military, and Will, I know you were in the military, we were soldiers.
Yes.
We put on a uniform. No one had to tell us, well, this is how a soldier acts. That's who we were.
Right. Dean, let me follow up on that. Let me ask you what I call a carnal question.
Okay.
And that is that, okay, if I'm saved, if I've accepted Jesus Christ as Savior, I know I'm going to heaven, then why should I act that way if I already have that? What's the payoff?
What's the payoff?
Yeah.
Because that's who you are. The payoff, we're always looking for a payoff. You know, the payoff is that's who you are. That's your nature.
Yes.
You know when you go against your nature. You're born again. You know Jesus Christ the Lord said, go out there and start going against your nature. And all of a sudden that Holy Spirit reminds you, that ain't your nature. You know, God wants us to love people, especially the people we don't want to love.
Yes.
You know that's it. They will know you by your love. Most Christians have forgot that scripture. Okay? And it doesn't mean you have to accept evil. Okay? Or those things that are not right. You can say what's not right. I always tell people, they said, I don't judge nobody. So I said, what do you mean? I just tell you what the judge said. I used to work in the court system. You know what I mean.
Yes.
The judge is the one that gives out the ruling.
Right.
And I may be the mouthpiece to tell you what the judge said. And that's all God. God's giving out the rulings. And all we're doing is telling them, this is what the judge said. Okay? Yeah. And so we said, well, that's your belief system. Okay, but that's what the judge said.
Yes.
You understand what I mean? But the reality, if we really think about it, Will, is God's put that nature in the inside of you.
Yes.
And so now you're what we say, coming in alignment with what you are. You're going to be kind because that's who you are. Yes. You're going to be gentle because that's who you are.
So when you're not, you're ultimately in rebellion against yourself and the Holy Spirit.
You're in rebellion against who you are. You're denying who you are. You know how people always want to say, we're the sons of God, the son kingship. Well, if you are, act like it.
Yes.
You know, not because it gets you somewhere, because that's who you are. I care for people because that's who I am. I love people because that's who I am. You understand what I mean?
I understand.
Not because it's going to get me something. I can't understand something. You don't like me, that's okay. I still get to go to heaven.
Amen.
If you don't agree with me, that's okay. I still get to go to heaven. That doesn't get me in. Jesus does.
So the fruits of the Spirit are not things that we do, it's who we are.
It's who we are. We are.
Amazing.
Yeah. Is that good news?
Great news. Great news.
Absolutely.
Great news. You saw Jesus.
Yes.
You were at his feet.
Yes.
Did you communicate with him otherwise?
Yes.
Can you share with us a little bit about that?
You know, after I saw him and I said those statements, you did this for me, and thank you, I started looking up his body. First, I looked at his feet, and his feet loved me. You know, I experienced the fullness of the love of God through his feet. I'm getting to the point of your answering your question, but I just want to tell you how the process was to get there. And I'm understanding the fullness of God loved me through the feet of Jesus. I came to understand that love wasn't a blanket love that was given to everybody. That love was created just for me. I didn't know that. It's one of the boxes that were blown apart when I thought about it here on the planet. I used to think we all had this group of love, like we're all in the same room together, so we're all experiencing the room. No, in God's kingdom, when he created love for you, you have your own little room for love. You have your own little room for love. Each one of us have that going on. And I came to experience that by just looking at Jesus. You know, everything about him loved me. I get to his eyes and I look in his eyes and what do I see? I see the love he has for me, like I'm the only one he loves. I know he loves others. It's not like I thought, I'm the only one. No, I know he loves others, but I was receiving the love he created for me. I think sometimes when we're in a service and we're experiencing God in such a powerful way, and all of a sudden we look around, it doesn't seem like anybody else is experiencing him. I really think what's going on at that moment is you're experiencing the love he has for you. It's personal. It's that personal. So I'm looking at him, and I look in his eyes, and I think about somebody. And when I think about somebody, I see the love for them like he only loves them. Everybody I change my mind to in the thought, and you got to think how fast I'm flipping thoughts in my head. All of a sudden, it looks like he only loved them. And then this is what got me. Was I said to him, and thought that there was me speaking to him. The only time he spoke to me is when he said, no, it's not your time, go back. Everything else is thought to thought, you know. And here I am talking to him, and I say to him, you really do want everybody here. That's what I said. You know, we always say God wants everybody there. Yeah. Oh, well, I saw it. He wants everybody there. And I had a process with him because I used to work in the juvenile justice system. And one of the worst things that ever happened working with kids is working with kids that have been molested, sexually molested, okay? Yes. It damages a person like people don't realize, okay? And the only one that can heal that is Jesus Christ. There's counseling. I've seen it, okay? But really when I've seen a person really be delivered, it's through Christ. So I said this, and I don't know why I said this. I said, even child molesters. Now, don't think I hadn't said that he wants everybody, even those people that molest children, okay? But I thought they'd get in at the last minute. They'd be the last to get into the kingdom because I saw the damage that does for a kid, because I love kids. And I just remember saying, even child molesters? And he said something to me, and this is what he said to me, thought to thought. When you put a person in jail, they get out. They either get out because their time's up, or they get out because they die, but they get out. But when we put a person in hell, they're there for eternity. That's what he said. And he's not looking at me when he says this. He's still looking at the crowd. He turns, I'm on my hands and knees, remember? He turns and he looks down and he says to me, you know, who are you to nullify what I have done?
Thank you. Dean Braxton, the man who died and went to heaven. We just talked about Jesus and Dean seeing Jesus in heaven.
Thank you for watching this program, many of the programs on this TV7, because TV7 reaches so many places throughout the country, but also the world. And your support goes a long way in helping people to know Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. You know, I had the experience of dying and going to be with the Father and Jesus in heaven. I wouldn't have been able to have that if I didn't accept Jesus as Lord, but I had to first hear. This station of TV7 helps people to hear the gospel, to hear the good news. So you can look at the number down at the bottom of the screen, and you can support this station in whatever way you can to help people to come to know Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. Again, thank you very much.